Welcome to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. It's a limited series for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. We highlight the influential voices, partners, and leaders who are driving innovation, research, and development, creating new market opportunities and new ways of doing business in the mining industry.
My name is Brandon Ringham. I'm a consultant with Creative Fire. Visiting today on Treaty 13 territory here in Toronto, traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Sorry, my coffee's still kicking in. I identify as mixed Indigenous on my mom's side. I identify as Native and French Canadian on my dad's side, more from Anglo ancestry, and it's important to talk about when we talk about the work that we do at Creative Fire in the spirit of reconciliation and building Indigenous economies, that we acknowledge the truth. And my truth is that I hold a lot of interesting facts of Canada's history in me. So I always start with what makes me, Brandon, going forward.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So
there is, yeah.
I think it's interesting, Brandon, that we talk about your consultancy in terms of truth and reconciliation. I don't think that in and of itself is unusual, but I think it's important that it's in this room, right? When we talk about the strength and the predominance of mining specifically is where we are, but it's a natural resource, right? And so much of it happens, along with forestry, et cetera, on Indigenous traditional lands, you know? And as we have this conversation, it's really difficult, and you will know this better than I, to get anywhere with any kind of traction or substance without taking into account the traditional practices, whether it is in, how we deal with our forests, our lakes, the mines, etc. So where does your consultancy live more, in terms of with First Nations and Indigenous communities, or with the non-Indigenous community?
It's exactly right in the middle. So although we are headquartered out of the Urban Common Reserve of English River First Nation in Saskatoon, we work nationally across Canada with both corporate clients that would be non-Indigenous owned or controlled, as well as the nations and the communities, Indigenous communities, Métis and Inuit across Canada. When we talk about how we engage our clients, depending on what it is, and quite often it's in the realm of sustainability, ESGI, or reconciliation. Those are quite often...
Just to hold on for a second, because we've been throwing around the phrase ESG a lot in this conversation. I know what the I is, and I think it's important for you to, really highlight that.
Absolutely. So ESGI being environmental, social, governance, and Indigenous inclusion when we talk about materiality. So when we look at some of our corporate clients, again, specifically being here at PDAC, looking at a lot of mining and natural resource clients, we need to be mindful of the Indigenous, Aboriginal, and treaty rights as defined in the Constitution and Indian Act. There's different terminologies. I know Aboriginal is not one we use quite often anymore, but
you don't use Indian either, but let's not go down that road.
We don't. No. Well, some people still do, especially being out in Calgary. There's quite a few folks who identify as Indian. That all being said, when we talk about that materiality, we do take an Indigenous traditional knowledge lens as well. So that's when we look to engage nations. Everything.
So let me just ask, because I think this is important. When you talk about the traditional Indigenous lens, and that's important. And then on the other hand, you're talking about you're not just a stakeholder, you're a rights holder, I think is the phrase I hear.
Yep.
And under the Constitution and all the whatever treaties were or weren't signed or acknowledged. Those two things are two different lanes to some degree, right? And one informs the other. When you open the conversation, where do you start that?
In terms of, when you say
start
the two lanes,
when I say there's two lanes
and stakeholders?
When I say that if you're a rights holder and you approach it from there, and that is viewed in terms of the construct of our Constitution and our political setup. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, though, you're also looking at the traditional approaches and the traditional relationship with, the earth, generally speaking. Where does your conversation start? Generally, more often than not, with that traditional approach and the observance of it, or the observance of the rights holder?
So we'll often start with the rights holder and understanding what inherent rights and treaty rights that those nations or communities hold. And when we're invited to community, and that's very important that we highlight the word invited, everything that we do in terms of community and Indigenous engagement, we are invited to participate. We do hold a lot of connections through our employees and through our previous work that allow us access and the privilege to be able to speak to a lot of communities and Indigenous stakeholders and rights holders as well. But when we go forward into actually having those conversations, it's important to understand the inherent rights and the inherent absolute musts and the absolute must nots when we go forward. And then we build, depending on what nation it is. Of course, we have over 600 First Nations here in Canada, so it's important to understand their creation stories, their cultures, their ceremonies, and understand the ways of knowing and the ways of doing that nation specifically wants to see reflected in the work that we provide to either the nation or to the community or corporate clients across Canada.
Is there a different conversation substantively when we're talking about mining versus, forestry or whatever other kind of area of natural resource that you might get into?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about mining, ultimately it is on treaty land or traditional territory. So there is a conversation around who has ownership of that land, who has rights to those resources, and then in addition, in relation to the extraction of those resources, then how does that interrupt traditional ways of life for those nations that claim that territory? As well, throughout mining operations, there's often effluent or any sort of runoff, slurry, brine, what have you, that can impact local watersheds, can impact local environments, forests, ecosystems. So it's important when we talk again through that ESGI lens that we consider Indigenous ways of knowing and doing when we go about building their environmental and their sustainability strategies.
So is there something, and again, that lens of the traditional approach, and I understand, that's 7 generations back and 7 generations forward in terms of how we define where we are in our relationship with whatever part of the earth that we're living on. It sounds like it's an important part of the conversation. And what the realization I've come to lately is we're coming around to a point where, generally speaking, the new science, the new technology is all beginning to embrace the Indigenous approach. They may not say that, they may not call it that, but they're actually embracing really old wisdom.
Yes, yeah.
And I just wonder how prominent that realization is as you kind of go through this process, whether or not maybe it's just me, but I get the impression that there has to be a, oh, I get it now moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a really great book that talks about this. So it's Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. For listeners, please feel free to check it out. Not that I'm sponsoring or anything. I don't get paid by it, but she's an ethnobotanist who blends her Potawatomi background with her scientific teaching. She's a professor at a number of different colleges, and she talks about what we would consider maybe a Western or Eurocentric scientific approach of all these controlled variables, all these different experiments, very sterile environments, with understanding the integration in an Indigenous mindset in an ecosystem ultimately. And another great teaching that I had with Kita Gladu is it's how we perceive ourselves in different communities. So in the Western approach, myself, Brandon, I live in Calgary now. I identify as a skier, so therefore I belong to the skiing community. I identify as queer. I therefore belong to the queer community. You almost fracture yourself into all these different facets and clean-cut lines to belong to one community or another. The Indigenous perspective flips that around. Everybody in their entire being is a part of community. And when you bring everybody together, their strengths and their weaknesses, their proclivities, their whatever they may be that makes that person, that's when you can build strong and sustainable ecosystems and ways of life and communities and economies.
Yeah, and it's as simple as that sounds, and you will know this better than anybody. It frightens people.
It does. It
right?
does.
Because, again, we're back to this. I just had a conversation about we can't do it the way we've always done it.
No.
And taking people out, and you have literally described taking people out of their comfort zones in many respects, whether, it's how you identify as this, that, or the other thing, whether or not it's your land, you're a stakeholder, you're a rights holder. I want to get back to the beginning of the conversation. This is all happening around truth and reconciliation. This is at the heart of that truth.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And being able to acknowledge that in terms of how we extract whatever from the earth is part of this truth and reconciliation process.
I agree. And it's important to understand the phrasing truth and reconciliation. And you will hear quite often from a variety of different people that truth must come before reconciliation. I think that we've done some really great progress on how Canadians understand Indigenous cultures and histories, as well as our modern presence today. I think people forget that we still exist here today, and that's a function of some of our education and some of the systems built around it. But when we talk about the truth, when we lay the facts out on the table, when we're able to understand all the grievances, all the broken promises and treaties, agreements, what have you, that's when you can say, okay, all the dirty laundry is aired. What do we look like moving forward? And we're resilient. We've been here thousands upon thousands of years with sustainable economies, trade routes, languages, culture, ceremonies. We know how to adapt to change over time, Indigenous folks, that is. And when we look at adapting into the future, there's no hesitation about the role that Canadians play in reconciliation, whether it's different corporations, whether it's public communities, whether it's part of the government. There needs to be a common solution understood by all that encapsulates all of these various aspects, but with that Indigenous lens.
Yeah, and I hear people sort of spit back at me, well, we've all got our own truth. Yeah, I guess, but that seems to be a dodge. It's a way out and an unwillingness to acknowledge that, to your point, we've kind of got to get it all on the table and understand that we're, figuratively ripping the Band-Aid here.
Yep.
And it's going to hurt.
Yep. Right? And there's a lot of trauma that still needs to be healed through communities, through individuals that were the fallout of unfortunate acts, policies, and other acts of colonization. There's a lot of healing in communities, and it's not something that, again, is a distant past. It's something that's ongoing now.
Well, I tell this story. My mom grew up in Chapleau, Ontario.
Okay.
And she called me about a year ago, and she was in touch with a friend, a school friend, right? Mom's in her 80s now. He was in a residential school in their community. They did stuff together socially. They, all the stuff, you go to the rink and play hockey, all that stuff they did together. She had no idea what was going on. For whatever reason, she had no idea. Whether it was because, and I don't think Mom wasn't paying attention, she's just not that kind of person. But she was close to these kids and didn't understand what they had gone through until 2 years ago. We find the unmarked graves and so on. And he talked to her about that. And one of her friends talked to her about that. And you talk about the pain, and I understand the pain that the Indigenous communities are suffering through. All of a sudden, she was overwhelmed because she felt like she had not done enough to help her friend when they were kids. And I don't think that's, and I'm not saying that that's an excuse by any stretch of the imagination, but that's part of it. And that's part of, sort of the other side of the coin where we don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that my friend went through that and I wasn't good enough to fix it or help him.
Yeah.
And there's a certain discomfort that we're not ready for.
And it's a hard conversation to really approach, and many people will hold different perspectives, right? Again, I want to stress we've got over 600 nations, we've got urban folk, we've got Métis, Inuit as well. Everybody will hold a different opinion, but the hard truth is, unfortunately, we are the product of a variety of different systems and oppressions that have led us to form certain mindsets or avoidances to tough conversations or really acknowledging the truth of what went on, throughout the course of Canadian history or the history of Canada. And this is something that I point out often. I'm 27, going to be 28 this year, born in 1996. So if anybody is older than I am, they've existed in a time in Canada's history where Indigenous, as they would call Indian residential schools and day schools, operated. A lot of folks don't know the last one closed in 1996, Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan. And that throws people for a loop. And this is something we often hear when we talk to a lot of corporate stakeholders, is that their kids are coming home and they're teaching them things about Indigenous peoples, cultures, etc., that they had no idea about growing up. And this is my own perspective, is there is a lot that can be done from the individual who does not identify as Indigenous to learn more about the lands that they're on, to learn more about where they come from, to learn more about the Indigenous peoples around the community that they live, play, and work in. Ultimately, I don't believe that there should be an overwhelming feeling of guilt, unless you're explicitly complicit in the acts of oppression, and you know what you're doing. But unfortunately, it's an ignorance of bliss, and a lot of people aren't ready for that conversation. You're right. A lot of people are scared to know what our government's done, what even some of our family histories have done, in relation to Indigenous folks throughout Canada. And it comes without, a lot of time it comes without warning. There's new things that come up in the media, and it can be very jarring for Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks alike. But the important thing is that we acknowledge it and that we have the appropriate healing to move forward, I don't want to say move beyond it, but to move forward, acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the history, and take it one step at a time. And I think that's why messaging and having Indigenous voices to the table when we develop solutions for clients. I don't mean to go back to Creative Fire. We're on almost a different conversation, but when we develop those solutions, we make sure that we include Indigenous voices to provide that firsthand experience, those perspectives, those ideas, those thoughts, strategies, what have you. We really need to make sure that we are providing an opportunity for Indigenous voices to be heard throughout Canada. Again, external to the work that we do at Creative Fire. How can you and your community provide a safe space for Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing?
Yeah, well, the C-suite conversation, the C begins to stand for courage, I think, more than anything, right?
Yeah.
Brandon, thanks for enlightening us. At some point, I'd like to catch up to you and talk to you about the conversations I've had with the folks at Meadow Lake, because I think that they are an incredible model of how the Indigenous community can not only thrive but create, a strong, robust economy in the resource area. So, but we'll have to catch up with you and talk to you again about that.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for listening to the Northern Ontario Mining Showcase podcast. The series is produced for the Echo Community Podcast Network by Story Studio Network and Clark Communications. For more information, visit our website, northbayecho.ca.